The rain came down like absolution that night, washing blood into the gutters of Elizabeth Street. It was November 1948, and Father Thomas Benedetto had been missing for 6 days. His black shoes were found at the edge of the Hudson, laces still tied, positioned as if he'd simply stepped out of them and walked into the water. But the current was wrong, the tide was wrong, and everyone who knew anything about the river knew that Father Benedetto couldn't swim. The newspapers called it a tragedy. The archdiocese called it a loss. The neighborhood called it silence, the kind that settles over a street when everyone knows the truth but no one dares to speak it. But this story doesn't begin with his disappearance. It begins 3 weeks earlier, on an October evening when the air still held summer's ghost, when Father Benedetto heard a confession that would cost him everything. Before we continue the story of the priest who learned too much, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell me where you're listening from. Which city? Which state? I'm curious to know who's brave enough to follow this story to the end. Father Thomas Benedetto had served St. Anthony's Church for 11 years, and in that time he'd heard confessions that would have broken lesser men. He'd heard wives confess to poisoning husbands who beat them. He'd heard sons confess to stealing from dying fathers. He'd heard the desperate arithmetic of poverty. How many meals can you skip before stealing becomes survival? How many lies does it take to keep a family whole? But he'd never heard from Salvatore Mangano. The neighborhood knew Mangano the way they knew winter, inevitable cold and capable of killing you if you weren't careful. He controlled the docks from Red Hook to Hoboken, the numbers rackets from Little Italy to the Bowery, and the politicians from City Hall to the State House. He was 53 years old, with silver threading through his black hair and eyes that had seen every variation of human weakness. Mangano didn't attend Mass. He sent his wife, Constanza, a small woman who wore her rosary like armor and her silence like a veil. She came every Sunday, always alone, always sitting in the same pew, third from the front on the left, where the morning light caught the dust and made it look like descending angels. Father Benedetto had spoken to her exactly 3 times in 11 years. Each conversation lasted less than a minute. Each ended with her eyes dropping to the floor, her hands clutching that rosary until the beads left marks on her palms. The church itself was a relic of better times, built in 1891 when Italian immigrants still believed America would save them. The stone was gray, streaked with soot from the factories that had since closed. The stained glass windows depicted saints with sorrowful faces, their colors faded to ghosts of red and blue. The confessional was oak, dark and scarred, smelling of wood polish and secrets. Father Benedetto heard confessions on Tuesday and Saturday evenings, from 6 until 8. He sat in the darkness behind the screen, his hands folded, his breath steady, listening to the catalogue of human failing. Adultery, theft, envy, rage. The 7 deadlies, and all their variations, whispered into the space between man and God. On October 17th, 1948, at 7:45 in the evening, someone entered the confessional who'd never been there before. Father Benedetto heard the door close, heard the rustle of expensive fabric, wool, probably cashmere, not the rough cotton of the neighborhood. He heard breathing, steady and controlled, the breathing of a man who'd learned to master fear. The silence stretched. Father Benedetto waited. He'd learned patience in the seminary, learned that confession couldn't be rushed, that guilt had its own rhythm. Finally the voice came, low, rough, with the accent of Naples still clinging to the vowels. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." Father Benedetto's hands tightened on his knees. He knew that voice. Everyone in 6 neighborhoods knew that voice. "How long since your last confession?" Another pause. Outside, a truck rattled past, its engine knocking. A dog barked. Someone laughed, the sound sharp and quickly swallowed. 32 years. The priest closed his eyes. 32 years of accumulated sin. 32 years of silence. "Tell me your sins, my son." What followed was not a confession in any traditional sense. Mangano didn't list his crimes like items on a shopping list. He didn't seek absolution through enumeration. Instead, he told a story. He spoke of arriving in New York in 1916, a boy of 21 with $8 and his father's name. He spoke of the docks, the work that broke your back before it broke your spirit, the foremen who skimmed wages, and the bosses who owned men the way they owned cargo. He spoke of learning that the world was divided into two kinds of people, those who took and those who were taken from. He spoke of prohibition, of the opportunities that opened up when the government decided to legislate morality, of boats in the night and warehouses full of Canadian whiskey, of policemen who looked away and judges who forgot how to read, of money that flowed like the liquor itself, cold and burning at the same time. He spoke of building an empire on America's thirst, of learning that every man had a price and most prices were cheaper than you'd think. A cop cost $50 a week, a councilman cost $500, a conscience cost whatever you were willing to pay to quiet it. He spoke of the men he'd killed, not in detail, not with pride or shame, just a number stated flatly, like reporting the weather. Father Benedetto's breath caught. The number was 17. Mangano explained the necessity of each death. The partner who'd tried to betray him to the feds in 1923, the rival who'd moved on his territory in 1927, the informant who'd sold him out in 1931, the lieutenant who'd gotten ambitious in 1935, the accountant who'd started talking to a reporter in 1938. Each killing was justified, in Mangano's telling, by the logic of survival. It wasn't murder, it was protection. It wasn't sin, it was necessity. The weak died, so the strong could live. That was the law of nature, wasn't it? That was God's own design. Father Benedetto listened. The screen between them seemed too thin, as if Mangano's words could pass through and stain him. He wanted to stop the confession, to invoke some rule that would let him escape this knowledge. But there was no rule. There was only the seal of confession, absolute and unbreakable. The Church taught that what was said in confession remained between the penitent, the priest, and God. No authority could compel a priest to break that seal, not the police, not the courts, not even the Pope himself. A priest who revealed a confession would be excommunicated automatically, cast out from the Church and from grace. Father Benedetto had always believed in that seal. It was the foundation of the sacrament, the promise that let people unburden their souls without fear, but he'd never imagined it would feel like a chain. Mangano kept talking. He spoke of his family, 3 sons and 2 daughters, all grown now. The sons worked in the family businesses, the legitimate ones, trucking, construction, real estate. The daughters had married well, doctors and lawyers, men who asked no questions and kept their own counsel. He spoke of his wife, Constanza, who'd stood beside him for 30 years without ever asking where the money came from, who'd raised their children to be good Catholics, who'd never missed a mass or broken a commandment. Who believed, Mangano said with something that might have been admiration or might have been contempt, that goodness could balance out evil like entries in a ledger. Then he spoke of why he'd come. 3 weeks earlier, Mangano had felt a pain in his chest, sharp and sudden, like a knife between his ribs. It had passed, but it left behind a fear he'd never felt before. Not during the wars with the Irish, not during the investigations, not during any of the close calls that should have ended him. He'd gone to see a doctor, a specialist in Manhattan who catered to men like him. The doctor had taken x-rays, listened to his heart, asked questions about his father and grandfather. Then he'd told Mangano the truth. His heart was failing. Not dramatically, not immediately, but inevitably. 6 months, maybe a year, maybe less if he didn't slow down, didn't reduce the stress. Mangano had never been afraid of death. He'd dealt it out too many times to fear it. But he was afraid of dying unconfessed, of standing before God with 32 years of unabsolved sin weighing on his soul. So he'd come to Father Benedetto, to the little church where his wife prayed every Sunday, where the neighborhood gathered to pretend they were good people. He'd come because he was out of time. Father Benedetto's mouth was dry, his cassock felt too heavy, the small confessional booth suddenly suffocating. Through the screen, he could see Mangano's silhouette, solid and unmovable. "Are you sorry for these sins?" The question came out hoarse. Silence. Long enough that Father Benedetto thought Mangano might not answer. "I'm sorry I'm dying," Mangano finally said. It wasn't contrition, it wasn't even close. But Father Benedetto knew what the Church taught, that perfect contrition wasn't necessary, that imperfect contrition, fear of hell rather than love of God, could still be enough for absolution. Could it? Could he absolve a man who'd killed 17 people and felt sorry only for the cancer eating his heart? The priest's hands trembled. He thought of the seminary, of Father Murphy drilling them on moral theology, on the casuistry that could justify or condemn any action, depending on how you framed it. He thought of St. Augustine, who'd written that God could forgive any sin if the sinner truly repented. But Augustine had never sat across from Salvatore Mangano. "You must make amends," Father Benedetto said. "True repentance requires—" "Amends?" Mangano's voice hardened. "You want me to confess to the police? Turn myself in? Destroy my family's name? Leave my wife and children with nothing but shame? I want you to seek true forgiveness. I'm seeking it now. From God, yes. But there is no but, Father. This is confession. You absolve me or you don't. That's the deal." It wasn't a deal. It was a sacrament, but Mangano made it sound transactional, just another negotiation in a life of negotiations. Father Benedetto's training told him what to do. If the penitent showed any contrition, even fear-based contrition, and promised to sin no more, absolution could be granted. The theology was clear. But his conscience screamed that this was wrong, that absolving Mangano would make him complicit, would stain his soul with those 17 deaths, and God knows how many other crimes. "I need time," Father Benedetto said, "to pray, to consider." "I don't have time, Father." The words hung in the darkness. A statement of fact, cold and final. Father Benedetto heard himself speak, heard the Latin words of absolution leave his mouth as if someone else was saying them. "Ego te absolvo a peccatis tuis." The formula was ancient, worn smooth by centuries of repetition. He spoke it mechanically, his voice steady even as his soul recoiled. When he finished, there was silence. Then the rustle of expensive fabric, the creak of the confessional door opening. "Thank you, Father," Mangano said, and then he was gone, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor, fading into the October night. Father Benedetto sat alone in the darkness for a long time. His hands were shaking. His cassock was damp with sweat. He felt as if he'd committed a sin worse than any he'd ever heard confessed. Not the absolution itself, which was his duty, but the knowledge that he'd let a murderer walk away clean, or maybe not clean. Maybe that was the comfort he had to take, because absolution didn't erase the past. It didn't bring back the dead. It only opened the possibility of forgiveness, and God would be the final judge. Father Benedetto told himself that as he locked the church that night. He told himself that as he walked the 6 blocks to the rectory, past the closed shops and the men smoking on stoops, their eyes following him with questions they'd never ask. He told himself that as he climbed the stairs to his small room, poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass, and sat by the window watching the street below. But he didn't believe it. And he knew, with a certainty that felt like prophecy, that he'd made a terrible mistake. Father Benedetto didn't sleep that night. He lay in his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the building settle and the distant sound of the city that never quite went silent. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shadow of Mangano through the confessional screen. Heard that voice cataloguing death like a bookkeeper tallying accounts. 17 murders. How many widows? How many orphans? How many mothers who'd buried sons, wives who'd identified bodies, children who'd grown up without fathers? And he'd absolved it all with a handful of Latin words. The Church taught that the seal of confession was absolute, that revealing anything said in the confessional was one of the gravest sins a priest could commit. The Code of Canon Law was explicit. Any priest who directly violated the seal would be excommunicated automatically. No trial needed, no appeals possible. It was called latae sententiae, a penalty that applied the moment the sin was committed. But what about indirect revelation? What if Father Benedetto didn't name Mangano, but simply told the police that someone had confessed to multiple murders? Would that break the seal? The answer was yes. The seal covered everything. The sin itself, the identity of the penitent, even the fact that a confession had occurred. Father Benedetto couldn't tell anyone anything. Not the police, not the bishop, not even another priest seeking counsel. He was trapped with the knowledge, sealed inside it like a tomb. By dawn, he'd made a decision. He would document what he'd heard, not in any official record, not in a way that could be discovered, but for himself, for his own conscience. He would write down the confession, seal it in an envelope, and hide it. If something happened to him, if he died or disappeared, at least there would be a record. At least someone might eventually know the truth. It was a compromise with his vows, a hairline fracture in the seal, but it was the only way he could bear the weight. He rose as the sun bled grey light through his window, washed his face in cold water, and dressed in his cassock. The fabric felt heavier than usual, as if Mangano's sins had added physical weight to it. Downstairs in the rectory office, Father Benedetto found writing paper, an envelope, and sealing wax. The office was small, cluttered with parish business. Invoices from the coal company, donation records, baptism certificates waiting to be filed. Everything mundane, everything clean. He sat at the desk and began to write. He didn't name Mangano, he used initials only, SM. He documented the date, the time, the content of the confession in careful detail. 17 murders over 23 years, the justifications offered, the lack of true contrition, the absolution given despite his doubts. He wrote for an hour, his handwriting growing smaller and tighter as he filled the pages. When he finished, his hand ached and his eyes burned. He folded the pages, slid them into the envelope and sealed it with red wax. Then he pressed his thumb into the wax, leaving a print. Not a signature, but a mark. Proof that it was his, that he'd done this, knowing the risk. But where to hide it? The church had 100 hiding places, loose stones, hollow statues, gaps in the old walls. But it also had 100 people who moved through it every day. Altar boys preparing for mass, women arranging flowers, men repairing the roof. Any of them might stumble on a hidden envelope. The rectory was no better. The housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, cleaned every room once a week, moving furniture, emptying drawers. She was thorough, almost obsessive about it. Father Benedetto needed somewhere only he had access to, somewhere that would survive if he didn't. He thought of the church's foundation, the basement that ran beneath the sanctuary. It was old, older than the building above it, part of an earlier structure that had burned down in the 1880s. The parish used it for storage, broken pews, old vestments, boxes of records going back to the church's founding. No one went down there except him, and even he rarely descended into that cold darkness. He took a flashlight from the kitchen, the metal tube cold against his palm, and carried the envelope down the rectory stairs, through the connecting passage to the church and to the small door that led to the basement. The door stuck. It always stuck. He had to lean his weight against it, shoulder to wood, until it scraped open with a sound like grinding teeth. The stairs were steep, wooden, worn smooth by generations of feet. The flashlight beam swung as he descended, catching cobwebs and dust motes, making shadows leap and twist. The basement smelled of stone and damp and time. The ceiling was low, supported by thick columns that looked medieval. Boxes were stacked against the walls, their cardboard softening with moisture. Old saints stared down from paintings too damaged to hang upstairs, their faces cracked and fading. Father Benedetto found a loose stone near the eastern wall, pried it out with his pocket knife, and slid the envelope into the gap. Then he replaced the stone, stepping back to make sure it looked undisturbed. It did. The envelope was invisible now, buried in the church's foundation like original sin. He climbed back upstairs, closed the door, and tried to convince himself he'd done the right thing. The days that followed felt like waiting for a storm. Father Benedetto conducted Mass, heard confessions, visited the sick, performed all the duties of his office, but everything felt fragile, as if the world was made of glass, and one wrong move would shatter it. Constanza Mangano continued to attend Sunday Mass. She sat in her usual pew, said her rosary, and avoided Father Benedetto's eyes. He wondered if she knew her husband had confessed. He wondered if Mangano had gone home and told her, shared the burden, or if he'd kept it to himself the way he'd kept everything for 32 years. He wondered if she suspected what her husband was. On Wednesday, Father Benedetto received a visitor. He was in the church office working on the parish budget when Mrs. Chen knocked and told him a man was asking to see him. Did he give a name? Mr. Caruso. The name meant nothing to Father Benedetto. He told Mrs. Chen to show the man in, expecting a parishioner he'd forgotten, someone seeking counsel or assistance. The man who entered was perhaps 40, dressed in a grey suit that had been expensive once, but now showed wear at the cuffs and collar. He had dark hair slicked back with oil, a narrow face and eyes that didn't match his smile. Father Benedetto, thank you for seeing me. He didn't offer to shake hands. "Of course. Please sit. How can I help you?" Caruso lowered himself into the chair across from the desk, moving carefully as if his body hurt. "I'm here about Salvatore Mangano." The name hit Father Benedetto like a fist. He kept his face neutral, his hands flat on the desk. "I'm afraid I don't know anyone by that name." Caruso's smile widened. It didn't reach his eyes. "Come on, Father. Everyone knows Sal. He's been a fixture of the neighborhood for a long time. I know of him, certainly, but I've never spoken with him." It was technically true. They'd never spoken face to face, only through the confessional screen. The distinction felt important, though Father Benedetto knew it was meaningless. "His wife comes to Mass here." "Many people do." Sure. Caruso leaned back, the chair creaking. "The thing is, Father, Mr. Mangano came here last week, Tuesday night, around 8 o'clock. He was seen entering the church." Father Benedetto's heart hammered. "The church is open to everyone." "Of course it is, but it's interesting timing, don't you think? Because 3 days after he visited this church, Mr. Mangano met with some associates and told them something that surprised everyone. He said he was getting out, retiring, turning over operations to his sons and stepping back. That sounds like a personal decision." "It does, except Sal Mangano isn't the kind of man who steps back. He's the kind who dies in harness, you know. So people are curious what changed his mind." Caruso paused. "They're wondering if maybe he had some kind of spiritual experience. Maybe talked to someone about the state of his soul." The implication was clear. Someone had seen Mangano enter the church, had drawn conclusions, and now they wanted to know what he'd said. Father Benedetto met Caruso's gaze. "Even if Mr. Mangano did visit this church, even if he did speak with me, which I'm not confirming, you must understand that anything said between a priest and a parishioner is confidential." "Confidential. Right." Caruso nodded slowly. "But not as confidential as confession, is it? I mean, confession is sacred. What's said there can never be repeated. But a regular conversation, that's different. The man was testing him, trying to determine whether Mangano had actually confessed or simply talked. I have nothing to tell you, Mr. Caruso." "Nothing?" The smile finally faded. "That's disappointing, Father, because some people are concerned. They want to make sure Sal didn't say anything unhelpful, anything that might cause problems for the family." "Are you threatening me?" "Threatening? No, Father. I'm just asking questions, making sure we're all on the same page." Caruso stood, smoothing his suit. "But I'll tell you what I told my associates. If Sal talked to you in confession, then you can't say a word. The seal protects him. And you." He leaned forward, hands on the desk. "So we don't have a problem, do we?" Father Benedetto said nothing. "Good." Caruso straightened. "Enjoy your day, Father. And remember, the neighborhood looks out for its priests, as long as the priests look out for the neighborhood." He left, the door closing softly behind him. Father Benedetto sat frozen. His hands were trembling. The office suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in. They knew, not everything, but enough. Enough to be watching, to be worried. And if they were worried, Father Benedetto had reason to be terrified. That night, Father Benedetto couldn't stay in the rectory. The walls felt too thin, the windows too exposed. He kept imagining footsteps on the stairs, shadows moving in the hallway. At midnight, he dressed in plain clothes, slacks and a sweater, no clerical collar, and left through the back door. The street was empty, the brownstones dark. A cat yowled somewhere, the sound lonely and sharp. He walked without destination, trying to clear his head. The October night had turned cold, frost forming on car windows. His breath plumed white in the streetlight. He found himself heading toward Little Italy, toward the social clubs where men like Mangano held court. He didn't know why, maybe to see them, to understand the world that had produced 17 corpses and would likely produce more. The Ravenite Social Club sat on Mulberry Street, a narrow storefront with frosted windows and a door painted green. Light showed around the edges. Father Benedetto could hear voices inside, laughter, the clink of glasses. He stood across the street, in the shadow of a barbershop awning, and watched. Men came and went, young men in sharp suits, moving with the swagger of those who believed themselves untouchable. Older men moving more slowly, their faces hard and lined. None of them looked like criminals. They looked like businessmen, like fathers, like anyone you'd pass on the street. That was what unsettled him most. Evil wasn't a monster. It was ordinary. It wore suits and smiled and called itself necessary. Father Benedetto was about to turn away when the club door opened and Mangano emerged. He looked smaller than Father Benedetto had imagined. Not physically. He was still solid, still commanding, but diminished somehow, as if the confession had taken something from him. Mangano paused on the sidewalk, lighting a cigarette. The match flared, illuminating his face. He looked tired. Sick, maybe, though it was hard to tell from this distance. Two men flanked him, bodyguards or lieutenants. They scanned the street with professional vigilance. Father Benedetto pressed himself against the barbershop wall, holding his breath. Mangano said something to the men. They laughed. Then all three climbed into a black Packard parked at the curb, and the car pulled away, taillights bleeding red into the darkness. Father Benedetto exhaled. His legs felt weak. He'd been foolish to come here, foolish to take the risk, if they'd seen him. But they hadn't. He was invisible, just another shadow in a city of shadows. He walked home through streets that felt foreign, as if he'd crossed into enemy territory and couldn't find his way back. The rectory, when he finally reached it, offered no comfort. It was just a building, and buildings couldn't protect you from knowledge. The call came on Thursday afternoon. Father Benedetto was in the church preparing for evening mass when Mrs. Chen found him. "Father, there's a police detective on the telephone." His stomach dropped. Did he say what it's about? Something about the parish records. It was a lie, had to be. But Father Benedetto followed her to the office and picked up the receiver. "This is Father Benedetto. Father, this is Detective Russo, 10th Precinct. I'm hoping you can help me with something." Russo, an Italian name. The detective might be someone who understood the neighborhood, who knew the unwritten rules. "I'll do what I can, Detective. I'm investigating a murder. Victim's name was Anthony DiGiovanni, killed 6 days ago. He was found in an alley off Mott Street, shot twice in the head." Father Benedetto's mouth went dry. "I'm sorry to hear that, but I don't see how—" DiGiovanni was a mid-level guy in the Mangano organization. Word is he'd been skimming, got caught, got handled. Standard business. Russo paused. "What's not standard is that Sal Mangano has apparently retired. Just announced it. Very sudden. I still don't understand what this has to do with me." "I'm getting there, Father. See, I've been working organized crime for 12 years, and I've learned something. These guys don't retire. They don't get religion. They don't walk away. So when someone like Mangano suddenly decides to change his ways, right after one of his guys gets clipped, I start wondering if maybe he's got a reason. Maybe he's sick. Maybe he's scared. Or maybe—" Russo let the word hang. "Maybe he talked to someone, confessed some things, and now he's worried those things might come back to haunt him." Father Benedetto's grip on the receiver tightened. "Detective, I think you're asking me to violate the seal of confession." "No, Father. I'm just trying to understand the timeline. Mangano visited your church on Tuesday the 17th. DiGiovanni was killed on the 20th. Mangano announced his retirement on the 21st. It's an interesting pattern. It's coincidence. Maybe. But here's my problem." Russo's voice hardened. "If Mangano confessed to crimes, past crimes, ongoing crimes, doesn't matter, and you heard that confession, you can't tell me. I get that. But if there are more murders coming, more bodies piling up because someone's trying to tie up loose ends, how do you live with that?" The question was a blade, sharp and precise, cutting right to Father Benedetto's conscience. "I don't have any information for you, Detective. Can't or won't. Both." Russo sighed. "You're a good man, Father. I can tell. But good men die in this city when they get caught between the wrong people. Watch yourself." The line went dead. Father Benedetto set the receiver down carefully as if it might shatter. His hands were shaking again. They seemed to shake constantly now. Russo was right, of course. More people would die. Mangano's retirement wouldn't stop the machine he'd built. It would just transfer power, create vacuums, spark new conflicts. How many more murders would spring from the 17 Mangano had confessed? And Father Benedetto had to stay silent through all of it. The seal of confession wasn't just a rule, it was a prison. On Saturday morning, Father Benedetto woke to find an envelope on the rectory doorstep. It was manila, sealed, with no markings or address. He picked it up slowly, feeling its weight. Something was inside, stiff and flat. He brought it to his room, locked the door and opened it. Inside were 3 photographs. The first showed Father Benedetto leaving the church late at night, captured from across the street. The second showed him standing outside the Ravenite Social Club, partially hidden in shadow but recognizable. The third showed him at the rectory window, visible through the curtains. There was no note, no threat. The message was clear enough. They were watching him. They'd been watching him for days, maybe weeks. They knew his movements, his habits, his vulnerabilities. Father Benedetto burned the photographs in the bathroom sink, watching the flames curl the paper, turn the images to ash. But burning them didn't make them less real. He was trapped. If he went to the police, Mangano's people would know. If he told anyone about the confession, he'd be excommunicated. If he did nothing, he'd spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, waiting for the consequences. That night, he wrote a letter to the Archbishop, carefully worded, explaining that he might be in danger, but couldn't explain why. He asked for a transfer, for reassignment to another parish anywhere far from New York. He sealed the letter and walked it to the corner mailbox, dropping it through the slot before he could change his mind. Then he went to the church basement, retrieved the envelope from its hiding place, and added a note explaining the photographs, the detective's call, the sense that time was running out. He returned the envelope to its hiding place and climbed back upstairs. The church was dark, lit only by the sanctuary lamp, that eternal flame that never went out. Father Benedetto knelt before the altar and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Or maybe he'd said them so many times they'd lost meaning. He knelt there for an hour, his knees aching on the hard floor, and felt nothing but emptiness. The Archbishop's response arrived on Tuesday. It was brief, bureaucratic, unsympathetic. There were no available positions at other parishes. Father Benedetto's request for transfer was noted and would be reviewed at the end of the fiscal year. In the meantime, he should continue his duties with faith and diligence. The letter was signed by a Monsignor Father Benedetto had never met. He read it 3 times, each time feeling the walls close in a little more. The church wouldn't save him. The police couldn't. He was alone with the knowledge, and the knowledge was killing him. On Thursday, November 4th, Father Benedetto decided to confront Mangano directly. It was reckless, possibly suicidal. But he couldn't continue like this, trapped between silence and terror. If he was going to die for hearing that confession, he at least wanted to look Mangano in the eye and ask him why. Why confess if you're not sorry? Why seek absolution if you plan to keep killing? Why drag a priest into your sins? He found out where Mangano lived. A brownstone on East 74th Street, respectable, anonymous, the kind of place that housed lawyers and bankers and men whose money was old enough to be clean. Father Benedetto took the subway uptown, riding in silence among workers heading home, students reading textbooks, mothers with children sleeping on their laps. Normal people living normal lives, untouched by the weight of secrets. The brownstone was 4 stories, red brick with white trim, iron railings on the steps. Lights showed in the windows. Father Benedetto climbed the steps and pressed the buzzer. A woman answered, not Constanza, but younger, probably a daughter. She looked at his clerical collar with surprise. "Can I help you, Father? I need to speak with Mr. Mangano. It's urgent." She hesitated, glanced over her shoulder. "Is he expecting you?" "No, but he'll want to see me." The woman disappeared into the house. Father Benedetto waited on the stoop, his heart hammering. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe he should leave before. The door opened. Mangano stood there, dressed in slacks and a sweater, a newspaper folded under his arm. He looked at Father Benedetto with no surprise, as if he'd been expecting this visit. "Father, come in." The house was warm, tastefully furnished. Family photographs lined the walls, children at graduations, weddings, Christmases. The photographs of a man who'd lived a full, normal, blessed life. Mangano led him to a study, closed the door, and gestured to a leather chair. Father Benedetto sat. Mangano remained standing, leaning against the desk. "You shouldn't have come here," Mangano said quietly. "I had no choice." "There's always a choice, Father." That's what you people teach, isn't it? Free will. Your men have been watching me, threatening me. Not threatening, protecting. Mangano's expression didn't change. The confession was between us. I want to make sure it stays that way. By terrifying me? By making sure you understand the stakes. Mangano moved to the window, looking out at the street. I came to you because I was dying, because I needed absolution before I met my maker. You gave it to me, and I'm grateful. But that confession put you in a difficult position. There are people, cops, rival families, men with grudges, who'd love to know what I told you. If they thought you might talk, they'd do whatever it took to make you. I would never... I know that, Father, but they don't. So I'm protecting you. The photographs, the visit from Caruso, it's all to remind you to stay quiet. For your own good. Father Benedetto stared at him. You're threatening me for my own protection? Something like that. And what about Di Giovanni? The man who was killed 3 days after you confessed. Was that protection too? Mangano turned from the window. His eyes were cold. Be careful, Father. He was going to talk, wasn't he? Maybe to the police, maybe to a rival, and you had him killed to clean up loose ends before you retired. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? Father Benedetto stood, his fear giving way to anger. You came to me and confessed 17 murders. You told me you needed absolution, but you didn't stop killing. You just paused long enough to get right with God, and then you went back to business. Mangano's jaw tightened. Di Giovanni was already handled before I came to you. His death had nothing to do with my confession. Do you expect me to believe that? I don't care what you believe. I care that you keep your mouth shut. The two men stared at each other across the study. Outside, a car horn blared. Children laughed, the sound distant and innocent. I should have refused you, Father Benedetto said quietly. I should have told you to go to the police, to face justice before seeking forgiveness. But I didn't. I absolved you because I was weak, because I was afraid, because I wanted to believe that God's mercy was infinite. He paused. But I was wrong, and now I'm paying the price. We're all paying the price, Father. That's life. No, that's damnation. Mangano smiled, but there was no humor in it. You think there's a difference? Father Benedetto left without another word. He walked down the stairs out into the cold evening and kept walking. He didn't take the subway. He walked all the way back to the church, 45 blocks, his legs aching, his mind numb. By the time he reached St. Anthony's, it was past midnight. The neighborhood was quiet. The church was dark. He let himself in, locked the door behind him, and sat in the front pew. He'd accomplished nothing. Mangano wasn't afraid, wasn't sorry, wasn't even particularly concerned. He'd confessed for his own reasons and would continue living by his own rules, and Father Benedetto was just collateral damage. The priest looked up at the crucifix above the altar, at Christ hanging in eternal agony, and wondered if faith was supposed to feel this much like failure. On Saturday, November 13th, Father Benedetto heard confessions as usual. The penitents came with their familiar sins, harsh words, lustful thoughts, petty thefts. He absolved them all mechanically, his mind elsewhere. At 7:30, someone entered the confessional. Father Benedetto heard the door close, heard the rustle of fabric. Then a voice he recognized. Not Mangano this time. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It was Caruso, the man who'd visited the rectory. Father Benedetto's blood chilled. How long since your last confession? Long time, maybe 10 years. A pause. I'm here because I did something I'm not proud of. Tell me. I hurt someone, not physically, but I made them afraid. It was my job, you understand. I was told to make sure this person knew to keep quiet. So I followed them, took some pictures, had a conversation, made it clear what could happen if they talked. Father Benedetto's hands clenched. Caruso was confessing to threatening him. This person you threatened, did they deserve it? Deserve? Caruso laughed softly. Nobody deserves anything in this world, Father. You get what you get. But no, they didn't do anything wrong. They just knew something they shouldn't know. And your employer ordered this? Let's say I was following instructions. The confessional suddenly felt like a trap. If Father Benedetto absolved Caruso, he'd be complicit in his own terrorization. But if he refused, he'd be breaking his priestly duty. Are you sorry for what you did? Father Benedetto asked. Silence. I'm sorry the world works this way. Caruso finally said. "But I'm not sorry I did my job. Then I can't absolve you." "No?" The voice hardened. "That's not how this works, Father. You have to forgive me, that's the deal." "There is no deal. Confession requires contrition. I'm here, aren't I? I'm asking forgiveness. That's contrition." "No, it's not." The confessional door slammed open. Caruso was suddenly visible, his face twisted with anger. "You think you're better than me, Father? You think you're clean? You're in this just as deep as anyone. Get out. Or what? You'll report me." Caruso leaned in, his breath sour. "You can't say a word. You're trapped just like the rest of us." He left, his footsteps echoing through the church. Father Benedetto sat frozen. His heart was racing. His vision was blurry. He'd refused absolution. It was his right, his duty even, when the penitent showed no real contrition. But it was also dangerous. Caruso would tell Mangano, and Mangano would... what? Kill a priest? Would he go that far? Father Benedetto didn't know. And that uncertainty was worst of all. On Monday morning, Father Benedetto received a phone call. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, male, professional. "Father Benedetto, my name is Frank Costello. I believe we have a mutual acquaintance." The name was familiar. Costello was one of the big ones, a boss who controlled politicians the way other men controlled dogs. "I don't think... Salvatore Mangano mentioned you. He's concerned about your well-being, Father. He asked me to reach out, to make sure you understand the situation you're in." "I understand perfectly." "Do you?" Costello's voice was smooth, almost friendly. "Because Sal tells me you've been asking questions, making accusations. That's dangerous, Father, for everyone involved." "I haven't told anyone. I know you haven't. And that's good. That's what needs to continue. See, Sal made a mistake coming to you. He was scared. He was dying. And he did something foolish. But you can't unconfess. The bell's been rung. So now we all have to live with the consequences. What do you want from me?" "Nothing. Just silence. Just to do what you're supposed to do. Keep the seal. Keep the secret. Keep breathing." A pause. "Can you do that, Father?" "I don't have a choice." "Good. Because if you decide you do have a choice, if you decide to be a hero..." Costello let the threat hang. "Well, we wouldn't want that. For your sake." The line went dead. Father Benedetto set the receiver down. His hand was shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. He was in too deep now. They were watching him, managing him, making sure he stayed quiet. And if he didn't... He thought of the photographs, of Caruso's anger, of Mangano's cold eyes. He thought of the 17 murders Mangano had confessed and wondered if he'd be number 18. That night, Father Benedetto went to the basement again. He retrieved the envelope, added another note describing the phone call from Costello, and returned it to its hiding place. If he disappeared, at least someone would eventually find the truth. It wouldn't save him, but it might condemn the right people. It was a small comfort, but it was all he had. November 20th was a Sunday. Father Benedetto said morning mass, his voice steady, his hands steady, everything steady except his soul. Constanza Mangano was in her usual pew. She looked older than usual, her face drawn, her rosary clutched tight. Father Benedetto wondered if she knew what her husband had done, if she'd spent 30 years pretending not to know. After Mass, as the parishioners filed out, she approached him. "Father, may I speak with you?" He wanted to refuse, but he couldn't. "Of course, Mrs. Mangano." They went to the side chapel away from the crowd. She stood with her back to the altar, her hands clasped. "My husband is dying," she said quietly. Father Benedetto said nothing. "The doctors give him 3 months, maybe less. He's not afraid, but I am." Her voice cracked. "I don't know what he did, Father. I never asked, but I know he wasn't a good man, not in God's eyes. Mrs. Mangano, please, I need to know. Did he confess? Before he dies, did he make peace with God?" The question was impossible. If Father Benedetto confirmed that Mangano had confessed, he'd be breaking the seal. But if he said nothing, this woman would die alongside her husband, tormented by uncertainty. "Your husband's relationship with God is between them," Father Benedetto said carefully. "But I can tell you this. God's mercy is infinite. No sin is too great to be forgiven if the sinner truly repents. Did he repent? I can't answer that, Mrs. Mangano. I'm sorry. She closed her eyes. Tears ran down her cheeks. I prayed for him every day, every single day for 30 years. I thought if I was good enough, if I prayed hard enough, it would make up for what he was. But it didn't work, did it? You can't balance the scales that way. God doesn't work through scales, Father Benedetto said. He works through grace. Then why do I feel damned? The question struck him silent. Because she was damned in a way. Damned by association, by loyalty, by love. She'd tied herself to Mangano, and now she'd drown with him, and there was nothing Father Benedetto could say that would save her. Keep praying, he said finally. That's all any of us can do. She nodded, wiped her eyes, and left. Father Benedetto stood alone in the chapel. The statue of the Virgin Mary looked down at him with serene compassion, but he felt no comfort, no absolution. He was drowning too. The following week passed in a haze. Father Benedetto performed his duties, ate without tasting, slept without rest. He felt like he was waiting for something, some final piece to fall into place. On Saturday, November 27th, it did. He was preparing for evening confessions when Mrs. Chen found him. Father, there's someone here to see you. He says it's urgent. Who is it? A police detective, the same one who called before. Detective Russo waited in the church office. He looked tired, his suit rumpled, his tie loose. Father Benedetto, thanks for seeing me. Do I have a choice? Russo smiled grimly. Not really. Look, I'll be direct. Salvatore Mangano is dying. Cancer. Probably has a few weeks left. Before he goes, there are people who want him to answer for his crimes. Not just Di Giovanni, but everything. Decades of murder, extortion, corruption. I can't help you. I know you can't tell me what he confessed, but here's the thing. Mangano's getting reckless. He's tying up loose ends, eliminating anyone who might talk after he's gone. 3 men have disappeared in the last week. 3 men who worked for him, who knew things. Russo leaned forward. You know things, Father. More than anyone. That makes you a target. Father Benedetto's mouth went dry. They've been protecting me, protecting you or keeping you quiet. Because once Mangano dies, that protection ends. His sons take over, and they're cleaning house. Anyone connected to the old man, anyone who might be a liability, they're gone. You're trying to scare me into talking. I'm trying to keep you alive. Russo pulled a card from his pocket, set it on the desk. This is my direct line. If you decide you need protection, call me. We can put you somewhere safe, somewhere they'll never find you. In exchange for what? Breaking the seal? In exchange for staying breathing. Russo left. Father Benedetto sat staring at the card. White, embossed, official. A lifeline or a trap, he couldn't tell which. That night he tried to pray again. He knelt before the altar, his knees aching on the stone, and begged God for guidance. But the church was silent. The sanctuary lamp flickered, the shadows pressed close, and Father Benedetto realized with cold certainty that he was going to die. Not dramatically, not heroically, just disappear. One day he'd be here, and the next he'd be gone, and the neighborhood would whisper for a week before forgetting him entirely. Just like the 17 men Mangano had killed, just like all the others who'd learned too much. The seal of confession would protect Mangano even in death, and it would kill Father Benedetto. He rose from his knees, walked to the basement and retrieved the envelope for the last time. He added a final note, dated and timed, explaining everything. His fears, his certainty, his resignation. Then he sealed it again and returned it to its hiding place. If they found him, if they killed him, at least the truth would survive. Buried in the church's foundation, waiting for someone brave enough to look. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. Father Thomas Benedetto left the church that night, walking slowly through the cold November air. The streets were empty, the windows dark. He'd been a priest for 18 years. He'd heard thousands of confessions, absolved thousands of sins. He'd believed in the seal, in the sanctity of the sacrament, in the power of forgiveness. But Salvatore Mangano had taught him the truth. Some sins couldn't be forgiven. Some secrets were poison, and some priests paid the price for bearing them. 6 days later, Father Benedetto's shoes were found at the edge of the Hudson River, laces still tied. The police searched for 3 days. They dredged the river, interviewed witnesses, followed every lead. They found nothing. Detective Russo made inquiries. He visited the Mangano family. He questioned known associates. Everyone had alibis. Everyone claimed ignorance. The archdiocese held a memorial service. Constanza Mangano attended, veiled and silent. She lit a candle, said a prayer, and left. The neighborhood whispered for a week. Then Father Benedetto was forgotten, just another casualty of a city that ate its own. In December, Salvatore Mangano died in his sleep, surrounded by family. His funeral was attended by 300 people. The mayor sent flowers. The newspapers called him a community leader. His wife, Constanza, lived another 12 years. She never missed a Sunday Mass. She never spoke of her husband. She died quietly, her rosary in her hands. The confession that killed Father Benedetto remained sealed in the church basement. The envelope sat in its stone hiding place, untouched, unread. The church itself was demolished in 1973 to make way for a housing project. The foundation was broken up, the stones hauled away as rubble. No one ever found the envelope. The seal of confession held, even in death. The truth stayed buried. And the neighborhood moved on, because that's what neighborhoods do. They forget. They survive. They make peace with what they'll never know. And in the darkness between knowing and forgetting, between silence and confession, Father Thomas Benedetto's voice whispers still, unheard, unavenged, but never quite gone. Because some secrets don't die. They just wait.